What if the cruelest rejection of your life turned out to be the greatest blessing you never knew you needed? Picture this. It's 1884, and you've just traveled halfway across the American frontier on nothing but faith and a handful of letters promising you a new life. You step off that dusty stagecoach, heart pounding with hope and dreams of belonging, only to be told you're too substantial for marriage and cast aside like damaged goods in front of the whole town. Most women would have crawled back home in shame, broken and defeated. But what happened next in the little town of Copper Ridge would change everything. Not just for one rejected bride, but for an entire community that was about to learn what real courage looks like when it's wrapped in kindness. This is the story of Margaret Rose Sullivan, a woman the world said wasn't good enough, and Jake Thornton, a ranch hand who saw something everyone else missed. It's about land grabbers who thought they could buy and sell people's lives, community bonds forged in fire, and a love so powerful it sparked a revolution against injustice. But most of all, it's about the moment when Margaret realized she wasn't too much for the world. The world had just been too small for her. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will remind you that sometimes the worst rejection becomes the door to your greatest destiny. And sometimes the person who seems to have the least to offer is exactly the one who'll fight hardest to protect what matters most. Margaret Rose Sullivan clutched her carpetbag tighter as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Copper Ridge's general store, dust swirling around the wheels like smoke from a dying fire. Through the grimy window, she could see the town spread before her, false-fronted buildings, hitching posts lined with horses, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing against an anvil. It should have felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, it felt like stepping into a story where she didn't know her lines. The driver called down from his perch, "Copper Ridge! End of the line, folks!" Margaret's stomach fluttered with a mixture of excitement and terror. After 3 days of bone-jarring travel from Boston, 3 days of practicing what she'd say when she met William Prescott, 3 days of imagining their wedding and the life they'd build together, she was finally here. Finally ready to become someone's wife, someone's partner, someone who mattered. She gathered her skirts and stepped down from the coach, her boots hitting the dusty street with a soft thud. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills dotted with cattle, purple mountains rising in the distance, and a sky so big it made her feel small and infinite all at once. "Miss Sullivan?" Margaret turned toward the voice and saw a man approaching from the direction of the bank. He was average height, well-dressed in a dark suit and polished boots, with carefully groomed hair and the kind of mustache that suggested he spent considerable time in front of a mirror. This had to be William Prescott, her intended. "Yes," she said, offering her most gracious smile. "Mr. Prescott, I presume. I'm so pleased to finally—" "You're not what I ordered?" The words hit her like a slap across the face. Margaret blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" William looked her up and down with the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock. His gaze lingered on her full figure, her soft curves, the way her traveling dress hugged her generous hips. When his eyes met hers again, they held nothing but disappointment. "I specifically requested a wife of refined appearance," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Several townspeople had stopped to watch the exchange, and Margaret felt their stares like brands against her skin. "Someone who would enhance my standing in the community. You're too substantial for my tastes." Too substantial. The euphemism hung in the air between them like a curse. Margaret had heard variations of it all her life. Too big, too much, too substantial, but never delivered with such public cruelty. "Our correspondence," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said you were looking for a good woman, someone kind and hardworking." "I was looking for a lady," William interrupted. "Someone who would be an asset to my business endeavors, not an embarrassment at church socials and town gatherings." He adjusted his cufflinks with practiced indifference. "I'm sure you understand that appearances matter in a place like this." The small crowd that had gathered murmured among themselves. Margaret caught fragments of their whispers. "Poor thing. False advertising. Should have known better." And each word felt like another nail in her coffin of humiliation. I have nowhere else to go, Margaret said, hating how desperate she sounded, but unable to stop the words from tumbling out. I sold everything I owned to come here. I followed your letters, your promises. That's unfortunate, William said, and he actually sounded bored. But surely you can find passage back to wherever you came from. A woman of your resources should have planned better. He turned to walk away, dismissing her as if she were a salesman peddling goods he had no interest in buying. Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the street, her carpet bag in one hand, and the ruins of her dreams scattered around her feet like broken glass. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in sympathy, others muttering about the nerve of Eastern women who didn't know their place. Margaret wanted to disappear, to sink into the earth and never face another human being again. Instead, she found herself staring at the general store, wondering if they sold tickets back to Boston and whether she had enough money left to buy one. "Ma'am? You all right?" The voice came from behind her, deep and gentle with a hint of concern that seemed genuine rather than morbidly curious. Margaret turned slowly, expecting to see another townsperson ready to offer hollow sympathy or cruel observations about her situation. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who seemed to belong to the landscape itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of honest work rather than soft living. His clothes were clean but well-worn, denim pants with patches at the knees, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and boots that had seen plenty of use. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see kind eyes the color of summer sky, and when he looked at her, she didn't feel measured or found wanting. Margaret started, then stopped. Was she all right? Was anyone who'd just been publicly rejected and humiliated all right? "I'm managing, thank you." The man glanced toward William Prescott's retreating figure, then back at Margaret. Something in his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Name's Jake Thornton," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Double T Ranch just outside town. Couldn't help but notice you might be in need of assistance." "I'm afraid I'm rather beyond assistance at the moment," Margaret replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "It seems my plans have changed rather dramatically." Jake's jaw tightened. "That business with Prescott just now, that wasn't right. No matter what arrangements you might have had, no man should treat a lady that way in public." Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give this town the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Thornton, but I'm afraid Mr. Prescott made his feelings quite clear. I'm simply not what he was looking for." "His loss," Jake said simply, and something in his tone made Margaret look up sharply. There was no pity in his voice, no false comfort, just a matter-of-fact statement delivered with quiet conviction. "You don't even know me," Margaret protested. "I know enough." Jake gestured toward her carpet bag and the small trunk the stagecoach driver had deposited on the boardwalk. "I know you had the courage to travel clear across the country to start over. I know you're standing here with your head up after someone tried to break you down in front of half the town. And I know Prescott's a fool if he can't see the strength it takes to do what you just did." Margaret stared at him, searching his weathered face for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive. She'd learned to be wary of men who offered help, especially to women society had already deemed unworthy. But Jake's blue eyes held nothing but honest concern and something else: respect. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. The question hit her like a physical blow. She had $32 to her name, no family to wire for help, and no plan beyond the marriage that had just crumbled to dust at her feet. The ticket back to Boston would cost most of what she had left, assuming she could even get one. And what waited for her there? A cold room in a boarding house, a job as a seamstress or governess if she was lucky, and the whispered story of her failure following her like a shadow. "I haven't decided yet," she said, though we both knew she had no real choices left. Jake nodded thoughtfully, then made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Sullivan. The Double T Ranch needs help. Cooking, mending, general keeping of the place. It's honest work for honest pay, and there's a small cabin on the property where you could stay. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and four walls, and you'd be safe. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of, but it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Still, she'd learned to be cautious of gifts that seemed too good to be true. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Jake's smile was slow and genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control. Maybe because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Or maybe just because it's the right thing to do." He picked up her carpet bag and gestured toward a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. "What do you say, Miss Sullivan? Ready to give Copper Ridge another chance?" Margaret looked around the town one more time. Behind her lay William Prescott and his narrow-minded rejection, the whispers of strangers and the death of dreams she'd carried across a continent. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility, and a man whose eyes held more warmth than she'd seen in years. "Yes," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I think I am." As Jake loaded her trunk into the wagon, Margaret caught sight of William Prescott watching from the bank's doorway, his face twisted with what might have been disapproval or second thoughts. Let him watch, she thought, with a surge of unexpected defiance. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt like maybe, just maybe, being rejected had been the best thing that could have happened to her. The ride to the Double T Ranch took them through rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle and patches of wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom despite the harsh Montana sun. Jake didn't fill the silence with empty chatter, seeming to understand that Margaret needed time to process the upheaval of her carefully laid plans. Instead, he pointed out landmarks: the creek where he watered the horses each morning, the grove where wild berries grew thick come summer, the distant peaks that turned purple and gold at sunset. "It's beautiful," Margaret said finally, and meant it. Boston had its charms, but there was something about this vast open country that made her feel like she could breathe again after years of holding her breath. "Gets in your blood after a while," Jake agreed. "Hard to imagine living anywhere else once you've felt this much sky over your head." The ranch came into view as they crested a small hill, a modest cluster of buildings nestled in a valley beside a winding creek. The main house was built of weathered wood and fieldstone, with a wide porch that suggested long evenings spent watching the sunset. Nearby stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a small cabin that would serve as Margaret's new home. "Welcome to the Double T," Jake said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful at her waist. "It ain't much to look at, but it's honest work and good people." The cabin was smaller than Margaret's bedroom back in Boston, but it felt like a palace compared to the dusty street where William Prescott had abandoned her. Someone, Jake mentioned it was Mrs. Henderson from town, had stocked it with basic necessities: a narrow bed with clean quilts, a small table and chair, a wash basin, and a wood-burning stove that already radiated welcome heat. Fresh wildflowers sat in a mason jar on the windowsill, and crisp gingham curtains framed a view of the distant mountains. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion she was trying hard to control. "Don't need thanks," Jake replied. "Just need someone who's willing to work hard and won't mind the rough edges of ranch life. Can you handle that?" Margaret looked around the simple cabin, then out at the vast landscape beyond. For the first time in years, maybe her entire life, she felt like she had room to breathe, room to become whoever she was meant to be, rather than whoever others expected her to be. "I can handle it," she said firmly. "In fact, I think I'm going to like it here." The rooster's crow came before dawn, slicing through Margaret's dreams like a rusty blade. She bolted upright in the narrow bed, disoriented and sore from sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The stagecoach, William Prescott's rejection, Jake Thornton's unexpected kindness, and this little cabin that was now her home. Through the window, she could see the first pale fingers of sunlight reaching across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing softly, and she could hear the sound of boots on the porch of the main house. The ranch was already coming to life, and Margaret realized with a start that she was expected to be part of it. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress, a brown wool that had seen better days but would serve well for work, and braided her dark hair back in a practical style. When she stepped outside, the morning air hit her like a slap, sharp and clean, and so different from the smoky atmosphere of Boston that she had to pause just to breathe it in. Jake was already at work in the barn, and she could hear him talking to the horses in the kind of low, gentle voice she imagined he might use with a frightened child. She walked toward the sound, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "Morning," he called when he spotted her. "You're up early." "I wasn't sure what time to start," Margaret admitted. "I've never worked on a ranch before." Jake emerged from one of the stalls leading a massive chestnut mare who seemed to tower over Margaret like a friendly mountain. "This here's Rosie," he said, patting the horse's neck. "She's gentle as a lamb, but she's got opinions about her breakfast schedule." Margaret eyed the enormous animal with a mixture of fascination and terror. "She's very large." "Most horses are compared to city folk," Jake said with a grin. "But don't let her size fool you. Rosie's got the temperament of a church lady, proper and polite, but she expects you to mind your manners too." Over the next several hours, Jake proved to be a patient teacher. He showed Margaret how to feed the horses without getting her fingers nipped, how to gather eggs from hens that seemed personally offended by her presence, and how to milk the 2 Jersey cows without ending up wearing more milk than she collected. Margaret's first attempt at milking resulted in an overturned bucket, an annoyed cow, and milk splattered across her skirt. She was ready to burst into frustrated tears when she heard Jake chuckling behind her. "What's so funny?" she demanded, whirling around with her hands on her hips. "Nothing," Jake said, but his eyes were dancing with suppressed laughter. "It's just that Bessie here usually only kicks when she doesn't like someone. Seems like you two are getting along just fine." Margaret looked down at her milk-soaked dress, then at the cow who was placidly chewing her cud as if nothing had happened. Despite herself, she began to laugh. "I suppose there are worse ways to make a first impression." "Trust me," Jake said, "everyone who's ever learned to milk a cow has worn more of it than they've collected. You're doing fine." By midday, Margaret had burned her first attempt at biscuits, let the wash water boil over, and accidentally fed sugar to the chickens instead of corn. But Jake never lost his patience, never made her feel foolish or inadequate. When she ruined a batch of stew by adding too much salt, he simply said, "Good thing the dogs ain't picky," and helped her start over. As the days passed, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Her soft hands grew calloused, her pale skin bronzed from hours in the sun, and her body grew stronger from the constant physical work. More importantly, she began to discover parts of herself she'd never known existed. In Boston, she'd been Henry Sullivan's disappointment of a daughter, too large, too plain, too much of everything that didn't fit society's narrow definition of feminine perfection. Here she was simply Margaret, a woman who could learn to handle livestock, who could cook a decent meal over an open fire, who could mend fence posts and patch roof leaks with the best of them. "You're a natural at this," Jake told her one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch owner, Tom Taylor, was away on business, leaving Jake to manage the property and Margaret to help keep everything running smoothly. "I never thought I could do work like this," Margaret admitted, accepting a cup of coffee from his weathered hands. "Back in Boston, I was considered rather useless. Good for nothing but playing piano and making polite conversation at dinner parties." "Their loss," Jake said simply, and Margaret was beginning to understand that when Jake Thornton said something, he meant it completely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. Horses nickering in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote, the gentle lowing of cattle settling down for the night. Margaret had never experienced such peace, such a sense of belonging somewhere. "Jake," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am?" "Why weren't you ever married? A man like you." She caught herself blushing. "I'm sorry. That was presumptuous." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his coffee cup cradled in both hands. "Was engaged once," he said finally. "Girl named Sarah Whitmore, banker's daughter from back east. Pretty as a picture, educated, everything a man was supposed to want." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to the story. Problem was, she didn't want the life that came with marrying a ranch hand. Wanted me to give up this work, move to the city, become something respectable. He took a sip of his coffee. Reckoned she thought she could change me into the kind of man she could be proud of in public. What happened? I realized that someone who wants to change everything about you doesn't actually love you at all. They love the idea of who they think you could become. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret could hear the old hurt underneath. Figured it was better to be alone than to spend my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. Margaret felt a sharp pang of recognition. I know something about that, she said softly. My father spent years trying to make me into someone more acceptable, smaller, quieter, more like what he thought a proper lady should be. Did it work? Margaret looked down at her hands, no longer soft and white, but strong and capable, with calluses earned through honest work. No, she said with a small smile. Turns out I'm rather stubborn about being myself. Good, Jake said firmly. World's got plenty of people trying to be someone else. What it needs is more folks willing to be exactly who they are. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice changes in herself that went beyond the physical. She walked taller, spoke more confidently, and found herself laughing more than she had in years. Jake's steady presence and unwavering respect had created a safe space where she could simply exist without constantly defending or diminishing herself. She also began to notice things about Jake. The way he always walked on the outside when they went to town together, subtly shielding her from curious stares and whispered comments. The way he remembered that she liked her coffee with cream and her eggs cooked soft. The way his face lit up when she laughed, as if her happiness was something precious and rare. It was during their third week at the ranch that everything shifted. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard voices from the direction of the main road. She looked up to see 3 men on horseback approaching the ranch. Not visitors, she could tell from their posture and the way they surveyed the property with calculating eyes. Jake emerged from the barn at the same time, and Margaret saw his entire demeanor change. His shoulders squared, his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he kept nearby, and his expression grew wary. "Afternoon," the lead rider called as they approached. He was a well-dressed man with soft hands and expensive boots, clearly not someone who made his living through manual labor. "I'm looking for Margaret Rose Sullivan. Heard she might be working here." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She'd been so focused on building her new life that she'd almost forgotten her old one might come looking for her. Jake glanced in her direction, and she gave a small nod to let him know these men were here for her. "Who's asking?" Jake said evenly. "James Morrison, attorney at law," the man replied, though something about his manner suggested his business wasn't entirely legal. "I represent certain parties who have a vested interest in Miss Sullivan's whereabouts." Margaret stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. What do you want?" Morrison's eyes swept over her, taking in her work dress, her sun-bronzed skin, her confident posture. "Miss Sullivan, I'm here to inform you that your father, Henry Sullivan, passed away 2 weeks ago. As his only surviving heir, you've inherited certain obligations." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret had known her father was ill. His letters had mentioned troubles with his health and his business, but she'd never imagined he was dying. "What kind of obligations?" she asked, though something in Morrison's tone already told her this wasn't going to be good news. Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "Your father owed a substantial sum to the Blackwood Land Company. As his heir, that debt has now transferred to you. The amount owed is $2,000, plus interest." $2,000. Margaret felt her knees go weak. It might as well have been $2 million for all the chance she had of paying it. "I don't have that kind of money," she said quietly. "No," Morrison agreed. "I didn't expect you would. However, the Blackwood Company is prepared to be flexible in how the debt is settled. Miss Victoria Blackwood herself will be arriving tomorrow to discuss terms." Jake stepped closer to Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder. "What kind of term?" he asked, his voice carrying a warning edge. Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "That would be between Miss Blackwood and Miss Sullivan. I'm simply here to ensure that Miss Sullivan understands the gravity of her situation. He folded the document and tucked it back into his coat. Good day, Miss Sullivan. I trust you'll be ready to discuss business tomorrow. The three men rode away, leaving Margaret and Jake standing in the dusty yard as the weight of her father's final legacy settled around her like a shroud. We'll figure this out, Jake said quietly, his hand touching her elbow in a gesture of support. Margaret looked at him, this good man who'd shown her nothing but kindness, who'd helped her discover strength she never knew she possessed, and felt her heart break a little. Jake, you don't understand. This debt, it's going to destroy everything. I can't drag you into this mess. Too late for that, Jake said firmly. You're not facing this alone, Margaret. Not anymore. But even as he spoke, Margaret could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and she had a terrible feeling that the peace she'd found at the Double T Ranch was about to be shattered forever. The letter had arrived at dawn, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose face bore the grim expression of a man delivering bad news. Jake stood in the doorway of the main house, reading the telegram with a growing sense of dread that settled in his chest like a stone. Margaret was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, a sound that had become as much a part of the ranch's morning rhythm as the rooster's crow or the lowing of cattle. She looked up when Jake entered, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. What is it? She asked, setting down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the oatmeal. Jake held up the telegram. Family emergency. My mother, she's dying. Her brother sent word from Colorado. Says if I want to see her again, I need to come now. The color drained from Margaret's face. Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry. He nodded grimly, already mentally calculating how long it would take to get to Colorado, how long he could stay, whether he'd make it in time. I have to leave today. The next train heading east comes through Copper Ridge at noon. Margaret moved around the kitchen with quick efficiency, packing food for his journey without being asked. Of course you do. How long will you be gone? I don't know, Jake admitted. Could be a week, could be longer. Depends on... He couldn't finish the sentence. Depends on whether his mother lived long enough for him to say goodbye, whether there would be funeral arrangements to make, whether his uncle needed help settling affairs. I'll manage things here, Margaret said firmly. Tom Taylor won't be back for another week, but I can handle the livestock and keep the place running. Jake looked at her, this woman who'd been a pampered Boston debutante just a month ago and was now confidently planning to run a ranch single-handedly, and felt a surge of pride mixed with worry. Margaret, that letter yesterday... We'll wait until you get back, she interrupted. Whatever Victoria Blackwood wants, it can wait a few days. Your mother is more important. But even as she said it, both of them knew that debt collectors rarely showed such patience. An hour later, they stood together on the porch as Jake loaded his saddlebags onto his horse. He'd chosen to ride rather than wait for the train. It would be faster, and he could push harder if he was on horseback. Take this, Margaret said, pressing something small into his palm. It was a button from her dress, the same brown wool dress she'd been wearing the day she arrived in Copper Ridge. So you don't forget to come back. Jake closed his fingers around the small piece of bone and fabric. I don't need a button to remember you, Margaret. Take it anyway, she said softly. Please. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gentle touch that spoke of promises and hope, and the future they were both afraid to name aloud. I'll be back as soon as I can. And Margaret, be careful. Don't trust anyone who comes around asking questions, especially if they mention your father or any debts. I'll be fine, she assured him, though they both knew she was anything but safe. Jake mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, because he knew if he saw her standing there, alone and vulnerable, and trying so hard to be brave, he might not be able to leave at all. The first 2 days passed quietly. Margaret fell into a routine of caring for the animals, maintaining the property, and trying not to think about the debt hanging over her head like a sword. She'd almost managed to convince herself that maybe Morrison had been bluffing, that maybe Victoria Blackwood would never actually show up. She should have known better. It was on the third morning that the riders appeared. Not the three men from before, but a small entourage that looked more like a military operation than a business call. At the center rode a woman in an elegant black riding habit, her dark hair pinned in a severe bun beneath a hat that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Victoria Blackwood had arrived. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the group approached, her heart hammering against her ribs. There were 5 of them, Victoria and 4 men who looked more like hired guns than lawyers or clerks. Whatever business Victoria Blackwood conducted, she clearly believed in being prepared for resistance. Margaret smoothed her apron and walked out to meet them, forcing herself to move with confidence she didn't feel. She would not cower on her own porch, would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. "Miss Sullivan," Victoria said without dismounting. Her voice was cultured, educated, with just a hint of Eastern refinement that suggested money and privilege. "I trust Mr. Morrison explained the situation to you?" "He mentioned a debt," Margaret replied evenly. "Though I'm not sure how my father's business dealings have anything to do with me." Victoria's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Oh, my dear girl, your father made them very much your concern when he put your name on the loan documents as a co-signer. Legally speaking, you've been responsible for his debts since you turned 18. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "Are you quite certain?" Victoria reached into her saddlebag and produced a sheaf of papers. "Henry Sullivan was very thorough in his record-keeping. Your signature appears on several documents dating back 3 years." With growing horror, Margaret recognized her own handwriting on the papers Victoria held, but not from loan documents. These were letters she'd written to her father, letters where she'd signed her name in love and trust, never imagining they could be cut out and attached to legal documents. "You forged these," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "You took my signatures from personal correspondence and—" "I did nothing," Victoria said smoothly. "Your father was the one who found creative ways to guarantee his loans. I simply honored the agreements he made." She folded the papers with deliberate care. "The debt stands at $2,000 plus 6 months of accumulated interest. That brings the total to $2,400. Margaret's mouth went dry. $2,400 was more money than she'd see in a lifetime of working as a ranch hand or seamstress. "I don't have that kind of money. You know I don't." "No," Victoria agreed, "but you have something else of value." Her gaze swept over the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy livestock, the fertile land. "This property, for instance." "This isn't my land," Margaret said quickly. "I just work here." "But your association with the ranch makes you valuable in other ways." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "I understand you've been living here with a man. Unmarried. How delightfully scandalous." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "My living arrangements are my own business." "Not when they affect your ability to repay your debts," Victoria replied. "You see, Miss Sullivan, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. Pay the debt in full, or come work for me until it's satisfied. 10 years of service should cover the principal, interest, and administrative costs." 10 years? Margaret stared at her in horror. "You're talking about slavery?" "I'm talking about honest employment with room and board provided," Victoria corrected smoothly. "You'd be well cared for, I assure you. My household staff wants for nothing." "And if I refuse?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Then I'll be forced to collect the debt through other means. Legal seizure of assets, garnishment of wages, perhaps even criminal charges for fraud if it turns out your father falsified documents in your name." She paused. "Of course, such legal proceedings can be messy. They tend to involve investigations into one's associates as well. This Mr. Thornton, for instance. I'm sure the territorial marshal would be very interested in his activities." The threat was clear, and Margaret felt her last hope crumble. Victoria Blackwood wasn't just after the debt, she was after control, the power to destroy anyone who got in her way. "I need time to think," Margaret said. "Of course," Victoria replied graciously. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning to decide. But Miss Sullivan?" She leaned forward in her saddle, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Choose wisely. My patience has limits, and my reach extends far beyond this little ranch." The riders departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving Margaret alone with the terrible weight of an impossible choice. She could surrender herself to 10 years of servitude, or she could watch Victoria Blackwood destroy everything and everyone she cared about. That night, Margaret sat by the window of her cabin, staring out at the vast Montana sky and thinking about the man who'd ridden east to say goodbye to his dying mother. Jake had told her to be careful, to not trust anyone who came asking about debts. But he'd never told her what to do when the debt was real, when the choice was between her freedom and his safety. As the first stars appeared overhead, Margaret made her decision. She found paper and ink and began to write. My dear Jake, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The debt my father left me is real, and the people collecting it are not the kind who accept excuses or payment plans. I won't let them destroy you or Tom Taylor's ranch because of my problems. Please don't come looking for me. I'm going to settle this debt the only way I can, and I need to know you're safe. You gave me something I never thought I'd have, a place where I could be myself, where I was valued for who I am rather than what I look like. That gift is worth more than any debt. Remember me as I was here, happy, strong, free. And remember that loving you was the easiest thing I ever did. Always yours, Margaret P.S. I'm keeping your button. Someday, when this is all over, maybe I'll find a way to sew it back where it belongs. But Margaret never had the chance to leave the letter. Just before dawn, she heard the sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop. Through her window, she saw a familiar figure dismounting in the gray morning light. Jake had returned. Margaret's heart leaped and broke at the same time. She'd hoped to be gone before he came back, to spare him the pain of watching her sacrifice herself for his safety. Now she would have to look him in the eye and explain why she was about to destroy the life they'd been building together. She opened the cabin door before he could knock, and the sight of him, travel-worn, exhausted but alive and whole, nearly brought her to her knees. You're supposed to be in Colorado, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was, Jake replied. Rode for 18 hours straight, changed horses twice, made it to Denver just in time to... He paused, and Margaret could see the grief etched in the lines around his eyes. Just in time to say goodbye. Oh, Jake. Margaret reached for him instinctively, pulling him into the cabin and into her arms. I'm so sorry. He held her tight for a moment, drawing strength from her warmth and presence. Then he pulled back and looked at her with eyes that missed nothing. What happened while I was gone? And don't say nothing, I can see it in your face. Margaret turned away, unable to bear the trust and concern in his expression. Victoria Blackwood came. The debt is real, Jake. My father forged my signatures on loan documents, and now I owe $2,400. Jake was quiet for a long moment. What did she want? 10 years of service to work off the debt. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I have until this morning to decide. And if you refuse... Margaret finally turned to face him, and he could see the fear she'd been trying to hide. She'll destroy everything. This ranch, Tom Taylor, you. Anyone connected to me will become a target. She has lawyers, money, influence. We can't fight someone like that. Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret saw something dangerous flash in his blue eyes. The hell we can't. Jake, you don't understand. No, Margaret, you don't understand. He crossed the small cabin in 2 strides and took her hands in his. You think I'm going to stand by and watch some land-grabbing snake steal the woman I love? You think I'm going to let her turn you into a slave because your father was a liar and a cheat? Margaret's breath caught. The woman you love? Jake's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her face in his calloused hands. Did you think I was keeping that a secret? Margaret Rose Sullivan, I've been in love with you since the day you stood up to those ranch hands who were mocking you in town. Since the day you decided to learn to milk cows rather than give up. Since every morning when you hummed while making breakfast, like you'd found something worth singing about. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. That's why I can't let this destroy you. I won't be responsible for... Jake silenced her with a kiss, gentle but firm, full of all the promises they'd been too afraid to speak aloud. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. We're going to fight this, he said quietly, together, and we're going to win. How? Margaret asked. She has everything. Money, lawyers, forged documents. She doesn't have the truth, Jake replied, and she doesn't have something else. He smiled, and Margaret saw the glint of an idea forming in his eyes. She doesn't have my family. Your family? Jake reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon. My mother left me more than just grief, Margaret. She left me information about a woman named Rosalind Sullivan who's been trying to track down her niece for the past 3 years. Seems your father told everyone you died in a fever, but your aunt never believed it. Margaret's heart stopped. Aunt Rosalind is alive? Very much so. And according to these letters, she's got lawyers of her own, money of her own, and a very strong opinion about men who forge their daughters' signatures on legal documents. Jake's smile widened. Turns out your father wasn't the only Sullivan with a head for business. Your aunt just used hers more honestly. For the first time since Victoria Blackwood had ridden onto the ranch, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Do you really think she could help? I think Victoria Blackwood picked the wrong woman to threaten, Jake said firmly. And I think she's about to learn that some debts can't be collected through fear and intimidation. The sound of approaching horses interrupted them, and Margaret's brief hope crumbled. Through the window, she could see Victoria Blackwood returning with even more men than before. 8 riders this time, all armed and looking ready for trouble. She's early, Margaret whispered. Jake checked his rifle and moved to the window. Then we'll deal with her early. Margaret, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Margaret looked at the man who'd shown her what love could be when it wasn't based on conditions or expectations, who'd seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only her flaws. With my life, she said. Good, Jake replied, because we're about to bet everything on the chance that love and truth are stronger than money and lies. Outside, Victoria Blackwood called for Margaret to come out and give her answer. But inside the cabin, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds were preparing to fight for their future, and discovering that sometimes the greatest strength comes from having something worth fighting for. Victoria Blackwood sat astride her black mare like a queen surveying her domain, her elegant riding habit pristine, despite the dust of the trail. Behind her, 8 men in dark coats fanned out in a semicircle, their hands resting casually on the butts of their pistols. The morning sun glinted off the silver spurs on her boots and the cold calculation in her dark eyes. Miss Sullivan, she called toward the cabin, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my generous offer. Margaret stepped out onto the small porch, Jake close behind her. She'd braided her hair back severely and worn her best dress, not out of vanity, but as armor. If she was going to face Victoria Blackwood, she would do it looking like the lady she'd been raised to be, not the desperate woman Victoria expected to find. I've considered it, Margaret replied, her voice steady. And I have some questions about the legitimacy of this debt. Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. Oh, and what questions might those be? The question of whether signatures cut from personal letters and pasted onto loan documents constitute legal binding contracts, Margaret said, stepping to the edge of the porch. The question of whether a man can legally bind his adult daughter to agreements she never saw or approved. The question of whether you actually have any right to collect this debt at all. For the first time since arriving, Victoria's composure slipped slightly. Her eyes narrowed and she leaned forward in her saddle. Careful, Miss Sullivan. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating facts, Margaret replied. Facts that any competent lawyer would be happy to present in court. Victoria's laugh was cold and humorless. And what lawyer would that be? Do you see any around here willing to take on the Blackwood Land Company? I own half the judges in this territory, and the other half know better than to cross me. Maybe so, Jake said, speaking for the first time, but you don't own all of them. Victoria's gaze shifted to him with the kind of attention a hawk gives to a mouse that's just moved too close to the open. Mr. Thornton, wasn't it? I was hoping we'd have a chance to discuss your situation. My situation? A man living unmarried with a woman of questionable reputation, Victoria said smoothly. Technically, that's still a crime in this territory. Moral turpitude, they call it. Could result in jail time, loss of employment, social ostracism, especially if certain influential people were to file complaints with the territorial authorities. Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. That's an interesting threat, ma'am, but it assumes we plan to stay unmarried. Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting that response. I beg your pardon? Margaret felt her heart skip a beat as Jake moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Miss Sullivan has agreed to become my wife, he said firmly. We're planning a ceremony next week, soon as the circuit preacher comes through town. It was a lie, of course. They'd never discussed marriage, never even spoken of love until an hour ago. But Margaret understood immediately what Jake was doing. Married women had legal protections that single women didn't, and debt collection became much more complicated when it involved a husband's rights to his wife's property. How convenient, Victoria said, her voice dripping with skepticism. A sudden engagement, right when Miss Sullivan's debt comes due. Love doesn't wait for convenient timing, Margaret said, sliding her arm through Jake's, as I'm sure a woman of the world like yourself would understand. Victoria's face flushed with anger, and for a moment her cultured mask slipped completely. You think a sham marriage will protect you? I'll have it annulled before the ink dries on the certificate. I'll prove it's nothing but a fraud designed to escape legitimate debts. Prove it how? Jake asked mildly. We've been living together for weeks. Half the town knows we've been courting. Mrs. Henderson has been asking when we plan to make it official since the day Margaret arrived. Besides, Margaret added, her confidence growing with each word, even if the marriage were somehow invalidated, it wouldn't change the fact that the original debt documents are forgeries. My signatures were taken from personal letters without my knowledge or consent. Victoria's hands tightened on her reins, and Margaret could see her struggling to maintain control of the situation. You can't prove that. Can I? Margaret smiled, and it was her turn to look predatory. I kept copies of every letter I sent my father. They're in my trunk, along with examples of my handwriting from before I ever came to Montana. I'm sure a competent handwriting expert would be very interested in comparing them to your loan documents. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Victoria's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the way the conversation was going. Their employer was supposed to be in control here, supposed to be crushing a helpless woman under the weight of legal documents and financial pressure. Instead, they were watching her lose ground to a ranch hand and a rejected mail-order bride. You're bluffing, Victoria said finally, but there was uncertainty in her voice for the first time. Am I? Margaret asked. Would you like to find out? Because I'm perfectly willing to let a judge decide whether my father had the right to forge my signature on documents worth thousands of dollars. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her powder and rouge. Margaret could see her mind working frantically, trying to find a way to salvage the situation. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its mocking tone. Even if the documents were irregular, she said carefully, your father still owed money to legitimate creditors. The Blackwood Land Company has a right to recover its investments. From the debtor's estate, maybe, Jake said. But Henry Sullivan is dead, and his daughter never agreed to inherit his obligations. Seems like your investment might have been a bad risk from the beginning. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. You think you've won something here? She snarled. You think I'll just ride away and forget about $2,000 because a ranch hand and a fat spinster think they're clever? Margaret felt the words hit like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from people who mattered to her far more than Victoria Blackwood ever would. I think, Margaret said quietly, that you've just shown everyone exactly what kind of person you really are. And I think that's going to make it very easy for people to believe that you'd forge documents and threaten innocent people to get what you want. The sound of approaching horses interrupted Victoria's response. Margaret looked past the line of armed men to see a group of riders coming up the main road, not more of Victoria's people, but townspeople from Copper Ridge. She recognized Doc Morrison, Father Miguel, Mrs. Henderson, and at least a dozen others. Tom Taylor rode at the front of the group, his face grim with purpose. He'd returned early from his business trip, and from the looks of it, someone had filled him in on what was happening at his ranch. Morning, Miss Blackwood, Tom said politely as he reined in his horse. Heard you were conducting business on my property. Hope you don't mind if we observe. Always interesting to see how outsiders handle their affairs in our community. Victoria looked around at the growing crowd of witnesses, and Margaret could see her calculating her options. Whatever she'd planned to do here, whether through intimidation, force, or legal pressure, it was much harder to accomplish with half of Copper Ridge watching. "This is a private matter," Victoria said tightly. "Not when it involves one of our own," Mrs. Henderson spoke up from the crowd. "Margaret's been a good neighbor and a hard worker. If someone's trying to cheat her out of money she doesn't owe, that's our business too." "Nobody's trying to cheat anyone," Victoria protested. "This is a legitimate debt collection based on forged documents," Father Miguel interrupted. His voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. "I've seen Margaret's handwriting many times in the church registry. I'd be happy to testify about whether those signatures match her natural hand." Victoria's face had gone from pale to flushed with fury. She was trapped, and everyone present knew it. Her forged documents wouldn't stand up to scrutiny, her intimidation tactics were useless with so many witnesses, and her threats of legal action rang hollow when the entire community was prepared to support Margaret's version of events. "This isn't over," she said finally, her voice shaking with rage. "I don't care what lies you tell or how many farmers and shopkeepers you get to back you up. I have resources you can't imagine, and I will collect what's owed to me." "No," Margaret said firmly, stepping down from the porch to stand directly in front of Victoria's horse. "You won't, because nothing is owed to you. My father may have been a liar and a cheat, but I'm not responsible for his crimes. And I'm not going to be intimidated by someone who thinks money and threats give her the right to destroy people's lives." For a moment, the two women stared at each other, one mounted and dressed in expensive black silk, the other standing in the dust wearing homespun cotton. But there was no question about which one commanded the respect and support of everyone watching. Victoria jerked her reins savagely, wheeling her horse around. "You'll regret this," she spat. "All of you. The Blackwood Land Company doesn't forget, and we don't forgive." "Neither do we," Tom Taylor said quietly. "And we've got longer memories than most." Victoria and her men rode away in a cloud of dust and bitter defeat, leaving behind a crowd of neighbors who were suddenly grinning and slapping each other on the back like they'd just won a war. "Well," Doc Morrison said cheerfully, "that was more entertaining than Sunday services. Though I have to say, Margaret, you handled that better than most lawyers I've seen." Margaret felt her knees go weak as the adrenaline of confrontation began to fade. Jake's arm came around her waist, steady and strong, holding her up when she might have fallen. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. "The debt part is," Tom Taylor said, dismounting and walking over to them. "But Jake here mentioned something about a wedding that needs planning." Margaret looked up at Jake, suddenly realizing what they'd committed themselves to in the heat of the moment. That is, we didn't exactly." Jake smiled down at her, his blue eyes warm with love and laughter. "Margaret Rose Sullivan, will you marry me? For real this time? Not just to fool land-grabbing snakes?" Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as she looked around at the faces of people who'd stood up for her when they barely knew her, who'd seen past her size and her circumstances to the person she really was. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I'll marry you." The cheer that went up from the crowd could probably be heard all the way back to Copper Ridge. But for Margaret, the only sound that mattered was Jake's quiet voice in her ear. "I love you too, you know. Have since the day you decided to stay and fight instead of running away." As the townspeople began making plans for a wedding celebration and discussing how to make sure Victoria Blackwood never bothered their community again, Margaret realized that she'd found something she'd never thought possible. A place where she belonged, people who valued her for who she was, and a love that had nothing to do with what she looked like, and everything to do with who she chose to be. The worst rejection of her life had led her to the greatest blessing she'd ever known. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach in Copper Ridge, Margaret Sullivan felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The wedding preparations should have been the happiest time of Margaret's life. Mrs. Henderson had taken charge of organizing the ceremony with the efficiency of a military commander, while Doc Morrison had volunteered his parlor for the reception. Father Miguel was polishing his best sermon, and half the town seemed to have appointed themselves as unofficial wedding planners. But 3 days after Victoria Blackwood's humiliating retreat, it became clear that her threats had been more than just empty bluster. It started small. Tom Taylor's credit was suddenly called into question at the bank. Father Miguel received an official inquiry about the moral character of his congregation from the territorial diocese. Doc Morrison found his medical license under review by authorities who'd never questioned his competence before. "She's trying to squeeze us," Tom explained to Margaret and Jake as they sat around the kitchen table, reviewing the latest round of legal harassment. "Can't get to you directly, so she's going after anyone who supported you." Margaret stared at the stack of official letters and legal documents that had arrived by courier that morning. Each one was carefully worded, technically legitimate, and designed to cause maximum disruption to the lives of people who'd done nothing wrong except stand up for her. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "If I'd just agreed to her terms from the beginning—" "Then she'd have won," Jake interrupted firmly, "and the next person she decided to target would have no reason to believe they could fight back." "But look what it's costing everyone," Margaret protested, gesturing at the papers. "Mrs. Henderson might lose her boarding house license. Doc Morrison could be stripped of his right to practice medicine. All because they helped me." "All because Victoria Blackwood is a vindictive snake who can't stand being told no," Tom corrected. "This isn't about debt collection anymore, Margaret. This is about power and whether people like her get to destroy anyone who crosses them." A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Tom went to answer it, returning with Sheriff Coleman, a thin, nervous man who'd always struck Margaret as more politician than lawman. "Afternoon, folks," Coleman said, removing his hat but not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm afraid I've got some unpleasant business to conduct." Jake stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the wall. "What kind of business, Sheriff?" Coleman pulled out a folded paper with an official seal. "I've got a warrant here for the arrest of Margaret Sullivan on charges of conspiracy to defraud creditors and falsification of documents." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication hit her. Victoria Blackwood wasn't just harassing her supporters. She was having Margaret arrested on fabricated charges. "Those are lies," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "Maybe so," Coleman replied, though he still wouldn't look directly at anyone. "But the warrant's been signed by Judge Harrison over in Silver Falls. I'm required to serve it." "Judge Harrison," Tom repeated thoughtfully. "Wouldn't happen to be the same Judge Harrison who owes money to the Blackwood Land Company for that fancy house he built last year?" Coleman's flush answered the question before he spoke. "The judge's personal finances aren't my concern. I've got a job to do." Margaret stood, her chin raised defiantly. "Then do it, Sheriff. But everyone here knows what this really is." "Margaret, no!" Jake started toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "If I run, it just proves their lies," she said firmly. "If I fight this in court, at least there's a chance the truth will come out." Coleman looked relieved that she wasn't going to resist. "I'll need to escort you to Silver Falls for arraignment. The judge wants to see you first thing Monday morning." "That's 3 days away," Jake pointed out. "Where's she supposed to stay until then?" "Judge Harrison has arrangements with a secure boarding house," Coleman said uncomfortably, "for defendants awaiting trial." "You mean jail," Margaret said flatly. "It's not exactly jail," Coleman protested weakly. "More like supervised accommodation." It was jail and everyone knew it. But before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them again. Through the window, Margaret could see a small convoy of riders approaching. Not Victoria's men this time, but strangers in expensive clothes riding horses that had clearly traveled a long distance. The lead rider was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pinned in an elegant chignon and clothes that spoke of real money rather than the flashy display Victoria preferred. She rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, and when she dismounted, she moved with purpose that brooked no delay. "Excuse me," she called toward the house. "I'm looking for Margaret Rose Sullivan." Margaret stepped onto the porch, her heart hammering with sudden hope. "I'm Margaret Sullivan." The woman looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then her face broke into a smile that transformed her stern features completely. "My dear child, you look exactly like your mother. I'm Rosalind Sullivan, your father's sister and your aunt." Margaret's knees went weak with relief. "Aunt Rosalind? But I thought—" Father said you were dead. Your father said many things that weren't true, Rosalind replied grimly, including that you had died of fever 3 years ago. I've been searching for you ever since. She gestured toward her companions. This is James Morrison, my attorney, not to be confused with any local legal talent, and David Chen, who specializes in criminal defense. Sheriff Coleman shifted nervously. Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but I've got legal business to conduct here. Oh, you must be the sheriff, Rosalind said pleasantly. How convenient. Mr. Morrison, would you be so kind as to show the sheriff our paperwork? The lawyer, a different man entirely from the one who'd threatened Margaret weeks earlier, stepped forward with a briefcase full of documents. Federal jurisdiction transfer, he explained to Coleman. Miss Sullivan's case now falls under territorial authority rather than local courts, pending investigation into judicial corruption and fraudulent debt collection schemes. Coleman's face went white as he scanned the papers. This isn't possible. Judge Harrison signed the warrant himself. Judge Harrison is currently under investigation by the Territorial Attorney General, Rosalind said smoothly. Something about accepting bribes from land speculation companies. Quite shocking, really. Margaret looked back and forth between her aunt and the sheriff, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Does this mean? It means you're not going anywhere with Sheriff Coleman, Jake said firmly, moving to stand beside her. And it means Victoria Blackwood just discovered that some people have more influence than she does. Rosalind's sharp gaze fixed on Jake with obvious approval. You must be the young man who's been taking care of my niece. I understand congratulations are in order for your upcoming wedding. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied. Though I have to ask, how did you know about any of this? When you've been searching for someone for 3 years, you develop a network of information sources, Rosalind explained. The moment Margaret's name appeared in any legal documents, I was notified. Victoria Blackwood's mistake was filing her fraudulent charges through official channels. Sheriff Coleman was backing toward his horse, clearly eager to escape the situation. I'll need to report this to my superiors. You do that, Rosalind said cheerfully. And while you're at it, you might mention that the territorial marshal will be arriving tomorrow to investigate certain irregularities in local law enforcement. I'm sure your superiors will find that information illuminating. After Coleman had ridden away in defeat, Rosalind turned her attention back to Margaret. Now then, my dear, I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation. There are things about your father's business dealings that you need to understand, and things about your inheritance that might surprise you. They gathered in Tom Taylor's parlor, where Rosalind spread out a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of Henry Sullivan's finances than anyone had expected. Your father was many things, Rosalind began, but he wasn't as careless with money as Victoria Blackwood would have you believe. He kept meticulous records, including copies of every document he signed and every document he didn't sign. She handed Margaret a leather portfolio. These are the original loan agreements with the Blackwood Land Company. Note that only your father's signature appears, with no mention of co-signers or inherited obligations. Margaret studied the documents, her hands shaking slightly. Then the papers Victoria showed me were complete forgeries, Morrison confirmed. We've had handwriting experts examine both sets. Victoria Blackwood fabricated every document she used to threaten you. But why? Margaret asked. If my father didn't owe money to her company, why go to all this trouble? Rosalind's expression grew grim. Because your father owned something Victoria wanted very badly. Water rights to 3 major rivers in this territory. Rights that are about to become extremely valuable when the new railroad comes through. Jake leaned forward, his eyes sharp with understanding. She wasn't trying to collect a debt. She was trying to steal inheritance. Exactly, Rosalind confirmed. Henry did owe money to various creditors, but his assets were more than sufficient to cover his debts. After everything is settled, Margaret stands to inherit approximately $8,000 in cash and property, including those water rights. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret wasn't a penniless debtor fleeing her father's mistakes. She was a wealthy heiress who'd been targeted by a criminal conspiracy. Victoria Blackwood isn't just a land speculator, Morrison explained. She's part of a larger operation that targets recently orphaned heirs, particularly women who might not have the resources to fight back. They use fraudulent documents and corrupt local officials to steal inheritances worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. How many people has she done this to? Margaret asked quietly. We've identified at least 12 cases in the past 5 years, Chen replied. All young women, all orphaned, all convinced they were destitute and had no choice but to accept servitude or forfeit property they legally owned. Margaret felt sick. Those poor women. That's why we're here, Rosalind said firmly. Not just to restore your inheritance, but to make sure Victoria Blackwood and her associates face justice for what they've done. Jake took Margaret's hand. What do you need us to do? Nothing dangerous, Rosalind assured him. The territorial marshal has been building a case against this operation for months. Margaret's situation is the final piece of evidence he needs to make arrests. What about the other victims? Margaret asked. The women who've already lost everything? If we can prove the pattern of fraud, their cases can be reopened, Morrison explained. Your courage in standing up to Victoria Blackwood might help restore justice for all of them. As the evening wore on, they planned strategy for the next phase of the investigation. Victoria Blackwood would be arrested within the week, along with several corrupt officials who'd been helping her steal inheritances. Sheriff Coleman would face charges for accepting bribes, and Judge Harrison would be removed from the bench. But most importantly for Margaret, the nightmare that had begun with her father's death was finally coming to an end. There's one more thing, Rosalind said as the meeting broke up. I'd like to give you something that belonged to your mother. She handed Margaret a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. Inside was a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. She wanted you to have this on your wedding day, Rosalind explained. I've been carrying it for years, hoping someday I'd find you to give it to you. Margaret opened the locket to find tiny portraits inside, her mother as a young woman, and her father before grief and disappointment had hardened his features. She loved him, you know, Rosalind said gently, before he let his pride and prejudices poison him. I think, in his way, he loved you too. He just never learned how to show it properly. Margaret closed the locket carefully. I forgive him, she said quietly. I have to if I want to be happy. Jake's arm came around her shoulders, warm and solid and reassuring. You're going to be more than happy, he said softly. You're going to be free. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret believed him. The morning of Margaret and Jake's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline Montana sky that made everything seem possible. Margaret stood before the mirror in Mrs. Henderson's best guest room, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. The dress had been her mother's, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Aunt Rosalind had preserved all these years. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment to fulfill its purpose. The locket rested at her throat, and her hair was crowned with a circlet of wildflowers that the local children had gathered at dawn. You look beautiful, dear, Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting the lace on Margaret's sleeves with maternal care. Absolutely radiant. I feel different, Margaret admitted, touching the locket gently. Like I'm becoming someone I never thought I could be. You're becoming yourself, Rosalind observed from her chair by the window. Perhaps for the first time in your life, you're free to be exactly who you are, without apology or compromise. Through the window, Margaret could see the preparations taking place in the churchyard. Tom Taylor and several other men were setting up tables for the reception feast, while Doc Morrison directed the arrangement of chairs and decorations. Father Miguel was polishing his spectacles and reviewing his notes, and children were running everywhere with flowers and ribbons. But best of all, she could see Jake standing near the church entrance, resplendent in a new black suit that Tom had insisted on buying for him. He was talking with some of the other ranchers, but his eyes kept drifting toward the boarding house. And every time their gazes met through the window, he smiled with such pure joy that Margaret's heart felt ready to burst. It's time, Mrs. Henderson announced, gathering up Margaret's small bouquet of roses and baby's breath. As they walked toward the church, Margaret was amazed by the crowd that had gathered. It seemed like half the territory had come to witness their wedding, not just the people of Copper Ridge, but ranchers and their families from miles around. Former employees of her father's ranch, and even some of the women who'd been victimized by Victoria Blackwood's schemes and had come forward after her arrest. They came to see justice done, Rosalind explained quietly as they paused at the church steps. Your wedding represents more than just love, my dear. It represents the triumph of truth over corruption, of community over isolation, of courage over fear. The interior of the church was packed, with late arrivals standing along the walls and in the doorway. But Margaret only had eyes for Jake, who was waiting for her at the altar with an expression of wonder and gratitude that took her breath away. Father Miguel's voice rang out over the assembled crowd. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who found each other in the darkest of times and chose to build something beautiful together. As Margaret walked down the aisle on Rosalind's arm, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the rejection that had seemed like the end of her world, the kindness of a stranger that had become the foundation of love, the courage she'd found when everything seemed lost, and the community that had rallied around her when she needed them most. When she reached the altar, Jake took her hands in his and Father Miguel began the ceremony that would make them husband and wife. Do you, Jacob Thornton, take Margaret Rose Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Jake said, his voice strong and clear, and I promise to love her exactly as she is, to support her dreams, and to stand by her side through whatever challenges come our way. And do you, Margaret Rose Sullivan, take Jacob Thornton to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Margaret looked into Jake's blue eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the limited, constrained existence she'd been taught to expect, but a life full of possibility, adventure, and unconditional love. I do, she said firmly, and I promise to love you with all my heart, to be your partner in all things, and to never again let anyone convince me that I'm not worthy of happiness. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation could be heard 3 counties over. Jake kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Margaret felt like she was flying, and when they turned to face their community as a married couple, she saw nothing but love and approval in the faces looking back at them. The reception that followed was unlike anything Copper Ridge had ever seen. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in attendance. Children ran laughing through the churchyard, and someone had brought a fiddle to provide music for dancing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret found herself whirling around the makeshift dance floor in Jake's arms, while their friends and neighbors clapped and cheered. Have I mentioned lately that I love you, Mrs. Thornton? Jake murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. Not in the last 5 minutes, Margaret replied with a laugh. I was beginning to worry. Well, we can't have that, Jake said, spinning her around once more. I love you, Margaret Thornton. I love your strength, your courage, your kindness, and your stubborn refusal to let anyone dim your light. I love you too, Margaret whispered. You saved me, you know. No, Jake corrected gently. You saved yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it. As the evening wore on, they received congratulations and well wishes from everyone in attendance. Tom Taylor announced that he was making Jake a full partner in the Double T Ranch, and that they would be expanding their operations to include some of the land Margaret had inherited. Doc Morrison raised a toast to love conquering all obstacles, and Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by revealing that she had tears in her eyes. But the most meaningful moment came when a shy young woman approached Margaret during a lull in the festivities. Mrs. Thornton, she said hesitantly, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I was one of the women that Victoria Blackwood. I lost my family's farm because of her lies. Margaret's heart clenched with sympathy. I'm so sorry. That must have been terrible. It was, Sarah admitted. But I wanted to thank you. Because you were brave enough to fight back, the territorial marshal was able to reopen my case. I'm getting my farm back, and Victoria Blackwood is going to prison where she belongs. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. I'm so glad. No one should have to go through what she put us through. The thing is, Sarah continued, I don't know how to run a farm by myself. I was wondering, do you think there might be room in your community for one more person who's learning to start over? Margaret looked around at the celebration surrounding them, at Jake talking with the other ranchers, at the children playing tag between the tables, at the neighbors who'd become family, and felt her heart swell with possibility. There's always room, she said firmly. In fact, I've been thinking about starting a school here in Copper Ridge, a place where children can learn not just reading and arithmetic, but practical skills like farming and ranching. Would you be interested in helping me teach? Sarah's face lit up with hope. You'd really want me to help? I'd be honored to have you, Margaret replied. It seems to me that people who've learned to survive the worst life can throw at them are exactly the ones who should be teaching the next generation. By the time the last guest departed, Margaret and Jake were exhausted but happier than either had ever imagined possible. They walked hand in hand to their new home, a larger cabin that Tom Taylor had insisted on building for them as a wedding present, and stood on the porch looking out over the land that was now theirs to share. Any regrets? Jake asked, his arm around her waist. Margaret thought about William Prescott and his cruel rejection, about her father's lies and Victoria Blackwood's schemes, about all the pain and uncertainty that had brought her to this moment. None, she said finally. Not a single one. Good, Jake said, lifting her chin so he could look into her eyes. Because this is just the beginning, Mrs. Thornton. We've got a ranch to run, a school to build, and a lifetime of adventures ahead of us. I can't wait, Margaret whispered, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like hope and happiness and the sweet certainty of love freely given and joyfully received. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of the newly completed Copper Ridge School, watching her first class of students work diligently at their lessons. The building was simple but sturdy, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a pot-bellied stove that kept everyone warm during the cold Montana winters. Sarah Mitchell had indeed become her teaching partner, and together they offered instruction not just in traditional subjects, but in practical skills that would serve the children well in frontier life. The girls learned to read and write alongside lessons in managing livestock and preserving food, while the boys studied mathematics and history while also learning to mend fences and shoe horses. How are they doing today? Jake asked, appearing in the doorway, with his hat in his hands and his face bright with pride. Wonderfully, Margaret replied, resting her hand on her gently rounded belly. Though I think some of them are more interested in speculation about when the baby will arrive than in their arithmetic lessons. Jake's hand joined hers, and they both smiled at the thought of their child growing strong and healthy, destined to be born into a community where love and acceptance were the foundations of daily life. Any word from Aunt Rosalind? Jake asked. She'll be here for the birth, Margaret confirmed, along with news about the final resolution of Victoria Blackwood's trial. Apparently, they've identified over 30 victims across 5 territories and recovered nearly $100,000 in stolen assets. And Blackwood herself? 20 years in federal prison, Margaret said with satisfaction, plus restitution to all her victims. Justice has a long reach when it's finally allowed to work properly. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when William Prescott had rejected her in the dusty street of Copper Ridge. She was no longer the frightened, ashamed woman who thought herself unworthy of love. Instead, she was a teacher, a wife, a soon-to-be mother, and a pillar of her community. More importantly, she had learned that true worth had nothing to do with the size of her body or the expectations of others, and everything to do with the courage to be authentically herself and the willingness to fight for what was right. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and Margaret watched with fond eyes as her students gathered their books and ran toward home, calling out cheerful goodbyes. In a few hours, Jake would return from his work at the ranch, and they would sit together on their porch, planning for their baby's arrival and dreaming about the future they were building together. The woman who had once been rejected for being too substantial had discovered that she was exactly substantial enough. Substantial enough to survive rejection and betrayal, substantial enough to build a new life from nothing, substantial enough to love and be loved without reservation, and substantial enough to make a difference in the world. As Margaret locked the schoolhouse door and walked toward home, She carried with her the certainty that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is really the best thing in disguise. And sometimes the person who seems to have the least to offer is exactly the one who ends up changing everything. The sun was setting over the Montana territory, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise. And Margaret Rose Thornton walked toward her future with her head held high and her heart full of the knowledge that she was exactly where and exactly who she was meant to be. And there you have it, folks. The story of Margaret Rose Sullivan, who learned that being too much for one small-minded man meant she was exactly enough for the right one. In a world that still judges women by their appearance rather than their character, Margaret's story reminds us that our worth isn't determined by whether we fit someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. It's determined by our courage to stand up for ourselves, our willingness to help others, and our refusal to let rejection define our future. The Wild West was full of people who didn't fit the mold: immigrants, outcasts, folks starting over after losing everything. But it was also a place where your actions mattered more than your appearance, where communities were built by people who chose to stand together, and where love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Margaret's journey from rejected bride to beloved teacher and community leader shows us that sometimes the doors that slam in our faces are just God's way of pointing us toward the windows that are about to open. And sometimes the person who seems least likely to save us, a poor ranch hand with nothing but kindness to offer, turns out to be exactly the hero we needed. So if you've ever been told you're too much, too different, too anything that doesn't fit society's expectations, remember Margaret's story. Remember that you're not too much for this world. The world is just too small for all the amazing things you have to offer. What did you think of Margaret and Jake's love story? Have you ever experienced rejection that turned out to be redirection toward something better? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories matter to us. And if this tale of courage, community, and unexpected love touched your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more Wild West stories coming your way, each one proving that even in the harshest circumstances, love, justice, and human decency can triumph over greed, prejudice, and cruelty. Until next time, keep your chin up, your heart open, and remember, you're not too much. You're exactly enough. This is Wild West Stories, and we'll see you on the next trail.